In the previous lesson, we learned how to solve quadratic equations. In this lesson, we will learn how to solve quadratic inequalities. So instead of equal signs, we're going to be seeing things like less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. Example 1, we have an inequality here. We're looking at x squared plus 8x plus 15 is less than or equal to 0. Now, I'm going to start this problem kind of in an odd manner. I'm just going to take that less than or greater than sign, and I'm going to save it for later. We're just going to go through and solve this problem as if it was a regular equation. So if you have x squared plus 8x plus 15 is equal to 0, and you're trying to solve for x, what I would recommend doing is factoring. So here we're looking for two numbers that multiply to positive 15 and add up to positive 8. That would be 3 and 5. 3 times 5 is 15, and 3 plus 5 is 8. So my factors would be x plus 5 and x plus 3. Now we learned in the previous lesson the zero product property. If you have x plus 5 times x plus 3 is equal to 0, that means one of those factors must be 0. So we're going to do x plus 5 is equal to 0, and we're also going to look at x plus 3 is equal to 0. And we're just going to solve for x for both of these little mini equations. So to get x by itself, here I'll subtract 5 from both sides. That's x equals negative 5. And for the other equation, I'll subtract 3 on both sides, which gives me x equals negative 3. Now, as far as graphing goes, we know that these two values right here, these are called the roots or the zeros of the graph. That's where the graph is going to cross the x-axis. So I'm going to put those points on our grid over here. We cross the x-axis and we cross the x-axis at negative 3. And we're looking at a parabola here. In fact, we're looking at a parabola that points upward, so it would be something that looks like this. Okay, now that equality sign, remember this wasn't a regular equal sign, it was a less than or equal to sign. So looking at my graph, the 2 points that I plotted first, remember that those points are called zeros. And I want to look at the part of my graph that is less than or equal to 0. So if those points on the x-axis are the zeros, the part that is less than 0 would be the part below the x-axis, this part right here in the center. That section that I just highlighted in blue, that is my solution region. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that part that I shaded in blue and I'm going to drop it down onto my number line directly below this. So I'm going to bring down the negative 5, and I'm going to bring down the negative 3, and I'm just going to shade right there in between those two values. That is my answer, and I can express my answer as an inequality. See, I've shaded in the center, so I'm going to write x in the center. And on the left-hand side, x is greater than or equal to negative 5. And on the right-hand side, my x is less than or equal to negative 3. And that would be my final answer. Take a look at solving a regular quadratic equation. And if we have a regular quadratic equation, the first thing we need to do is set it equal to 0. So I'm going to take this equation up here, this inequality, and I'm going to subtract 6x and move it to the other side. So here this is going to be x squared minus 6x plus 8 is greater than 0. Now from here, I'm going to save that inequality sign for later. I'm just going to treat this as if it was a regular equal sign. And we're going to go through and factor and solve for x. So here my factoring, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to positive 8 and add up to negative 6. That would have to be two negatives, negative 4 and negative 2. Negative 4 times negative 2 is positive 8. But negative 4 plus negative 2 is negative 6. So we're going to have x minus 4 and x minus 2 equals 0. Now, if x minus 4 times x minus 2 is equal to 0, that means one of those factors has to be equal to 0. So x minus 4 equals 0, or x minus 2 is equal to 0. And we're just going to take both of those equations and solve for x. So the equation on the left, we would just add 4 to both sides. We get x equals 4. And the other equation, I am going to add 2 to both sides, and we end up with x equals 2. Now these are not my final answers, because remember I wasn't using an equal sign. I have a greater than sign. So what I really need to know is what part of my parabola is greater than 0. So I'm going to be able to figure that out by graphing this. So those 2 points, x equals 4 and x equals 2, I'm going to plot those on the graph. So here's x equals 2, and here's x equals 4. And I'm drawing a parabola. My parabola would look something like this. And what I want to know with this parabola is 0. So this right here, I'm going back to that inequality sign. And I want to know what part of that parabola is greater than 0. So remember that these 2 points that I plotted, those are the zeros. So if the points on the x-axis are the zeros, and I want to know what part of my graph is greater than 0, that's going to be everything above the x-axis. So this part of my parabola here is above the x-axis, and this part over here is above the x-axis. Now what I just shaded in blue, that is my solution region. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that solution region, and I'm going to drop it straight down onto this number line. So I'm going to put my 2 on the graph, I'm going to put my 4 on the graph, and see how the parabola, how this is pointing up and outward? If I'm shading this, I'm shading outward. I'm just dropping that and compressing it down onto the x-axis. This is what my solution region looks like. And if I want to write my answer as an inequality, I have 2 separate shaded regions, so I'm going to have 2 separate inequalities. The left-hand side, I'm shading from 2 downward, so that's going to be x is less than 2. And for the upper shaded region, I'm shading everything above 4, so that's going to be x is greater than 4. And that's my final answer. Now let's try 2. Where we don't necessarily have to draw the graph out in detail. We just kind of want an easy sketch here. So remember the overall process. If we're going to solve this thing, the first thing we need to do is set it equal to 0. So I'm going to take this positive 6, and I'm going to subtract 6, move it right over to the other side. That's going to be 4x squared plus 5x minus 6 is less than 0. Now from here on, I'm going to save that less than sign until the very end. Really what I need to do here is factor and solve for x. Now this one's a little bit trickier to factor because it's not a plain old x squared. You have the 4 in front. So remember how we factor that? We take the 4 and we multiply it to the back. So instead of 4x squared, this is just going to be a regular x squared plus 5x minus 24 is equal to 0. So here we're factoring. We want to know what multiplies to negative 24. What times what equals negative 24, and then also adds up to positive 5. Let's see, that would be negative 3 and 8. Negative 3 times 8 is negative 24, and negative 3 plus 8 is positive 5. So it's x minus 3 and x plus 8. But remember, we multiplied by 4 up here, so we also have to divide those factors by 4. 3 divided by 4 can't be simplified, so we move that 4 to the front. That's going to be 4x minus 3. 8 divided by 4 is simplified to 2, so x plus 2 equals 0. Now, the zero product property, if you have 2 factors that multiply to 0, then one of those factors must be equal to 0. So we're going to take each factor, we're going to set both of them equal to 0, and now we solve for x. So to get x by itself, I'm just going to add 3 to both sides and divide by 4 on both sides. So that's going to be x equals 3/4. The other side, to get x by itself, All I need to do here is subtract 2. We get x equals -2. Now, those are not my final answers because this wasn't an equation, it was an inequality. So we're going to revisit that less than sign. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sketch a little graph over here. I'm going to draw a y-axis. And I'm going to sketch a parabola. I know my parabola needs to cross at -2 and at +3/4. I don't need to make this perfect. All I need is a picture of a parabola because I need to know if the points here on my axis, if those are called zeros, then the part that is less than 0 would be the part right here in the middle, the part below the x-axis. So you can see the shading is everything between -2 and 3/4. So writing my final answer, I would write -2 is less than x is less than 3/4. Because the part of that parabola that's shaded is the part in between -2 and 3/4. Example here, example 4. We've got 2x squared plus 10x plus 1 is greater than or equal to 3x plus 5. Again, the first step to solving a quadratic equation is always to set the equation equal to 0. So I'm going to take everything on the right side of the inequality and move it over to the left side. Since this is a positive 3x, I'm going to subtract 3x on both sides, and I'm going to make sure I stack it under the 10x because those are like terms. I'm also going to take this positive 5 and subtract 5 on both sides, and I'm going to make sure that I stack it underneath the 1 because those are like terms. So here we're dealing with 2x squared plus 7x minus 4 is greater than or equal to 0. Now at this point, I'm going to save my inequality sign for later. I'm going to go ahead and factor, solve for x, and then I'll figure out what I should do with that inequality sign. Remember, this isn't a regular x squared. You have the 2 out front. So to factor that, you're going to send the 2 to the back. It's going to be x squared plus 7x minus 8 equals 0. So to factor this one, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to -8 and add up to +7. So that would be -1 and 8. -1 times 8 is -8, and -1 plus 8 is +7. So x minus 1 and x plus 8. Don't forget though, we multiplied by 2 up here, so we do have to make sure to divide by 2 in this step. 1 divided by 2 can't be simplified, so we move the 2 to the front. That's going to be 2x minus 1. 8 divided by 2 can be simplified to 4, so there we have x plus 4. From here, we can set each one of our factors equal to 0. So we have 2x minus 1 equals 0, and we have x plus 4 equals 0. So solving for x, over here I'm going to add 1 to both sides, and then divide by 2 on both sides. So we get x equals 1/2. The other equation, I'm just going to subtract 4 on both sides. That's x equals -4. Now, we did all of that work, and that's pretty much the most challenging part. What we need to do is parabola. I've got an x-axis, I've got a y-axis, and I know that my parabola crosses the x-axis over here at -4, and it crosses on this side at 1/2, and I'm looking at a parabola here, and what I want is I want the part of the parabola that is greater than or equal to 0. So if these points on the x-axis are called zeros, then the part greater than 0 would be the part up above. So the part that I'm shading nice and dark here, that's the part greater than 0. Notice how those two pieces I've shaded are not connected together. They're separate, they're pointed outward. So as far as the x-axis is concerned, the part that I've shaded here is everything less than or equal to -4. And then separately, on the right-hand side, I'm shading everything greater than or equal to 1/2. Since there's two parts that are shaded, I have two inequalities. On the x-axis, I'm pointed out to the left, less than -4, and out to the right, greater than 1/2.